The series allows faculty members to share their amazing research, scholarship, and creative activity with the campus community each semester. And I'm pleased that the campus is continuing to offer this event, which is in its 15th year. And this afternoon, Anand Vaidya joins us. Anand is a professor of philosophy in the College of Humanities and the Arts and director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy. His research focuses on philosophy of mind, epistemology, critical thinking, and social justice from a cross-cultural and multidisciplinary perspective. And during a recent sabbatical, which I'm very jealous of, by the way, you traveled to India, New Zealand, Hawaii, and Japan to research non-Western philosophical traditions. His talk today is especially relevant as universities around the nation are discussing best practices for teaching critical thinking. And he will share reasons why educators should include ideas from Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism into contemporary critical thinking education, and how the expanded curriculum can be a benefit to the diverse students that we teach here at San Jose State University. But before we begin, I want to thank the staff and the university library, to give them a big round of applause for putting this together. The Spartan Bookstore, our RISCA Advisory Council, the Office of Research, and my office, the Office of the Provost, as we continue to support, thank you, the University Scholar Series. So now please join me in welcoming Anand to begin his lecture.
Can everybody hear me okay? Good? Volume's good? All right, so let me just begin by flipping the script a little bit from how this is probably usually done by thanking the university, the people that nominated me, my department, and Andy Feinstein for selecting me, because what I'm going to talk about today is something that is very controversial historically, and to even recognize that this is a conversation worth having is an achievement for the communities that I represent in this dialogue that I'm going to give today. So I just want to begin by saying that as someone who's been in the Cal State system since they first attended college, went through the UC system, and is now a professor at a Cal State, I can say that my educational experiences in the systems in California are very much influencing why I'm giving this talk. And it's a really big honor to the communities I represent that this is acknowledged as a conversation that can happen. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. So I'm actually going to give the argument of my talk in the format in which classical Indian philosophers from the 4th century would have given their argument. Rather than doing my own argument in a Western framework, I'm going to begin by doing it in the framework in which they present their arguments. So in classical Indian philosophy within the Nyaya tradition, the way in which you present an argument is by giving your thesis first. So I just want to talk right from the beginning about what the goal of my project is. The goal of my project is basically to start constructing new textbooks in critical thinking and to bring these textbooks into contact with non-Western philosophy as well as some sciences, and also to build smartphone apps and comic strips and other mediums in order to promote critical thinking education in a new way. So my basic worry in the background is that the kind of models we have of critical thinking right now are a bit deficient. And I'm going to try and give you the arguments and the reasons to see why they're deficient. So on this board right here, I have a list of some of the traditions that I'm paying attention to. It's Hindu traditions, Jain traditions, Buddhist traditions, cognitive science, social psychology, and behavioral economics. This is what I'm paying attention to. But it must be revealed right away from the beginning. This is non-exhaustive. I can't possibly do all the work or present to you all the work that needs to make the kind of textbooks that I'm talking about. So I'm just going to talk about what I'm familiar with and the research that I've been doing over the past 4 years. Okay. So why do I want to do this? This is usually the question that arises in a classical Indian philosophical debate. You have this thesis, but what's motivating it? What's the background condition under which you're driven to this? So there seems to be a common problem nowadays at many universities, and that problem is basically the following. There are STEM-forward policies that want to promote STEM education, and that leaves this fundamental question for the humanities. What sort of product are you putting forward for students that's extremely valuable? And the answer I think you can get is pretty much captured very well in Martha Nussbaum's book, Not for Profit. In this book, she basically sells a model where she says a lot of what the humanities have to offer is critical thinking for democracy. Now, I think that that's an excellent reason to promote humanities. That reason right there is good enough. But for some people, that's not the right reason. And I just want to leave it open from the beginning in this argument that you might have another reason why you think the humanities are important. The fact that this is a good reason doesn't preclude there from being other good reasons. So I'm just signing on board with this model right here. In her book, she basically lists out 9 different forms of critical thinking that are relevant for participation in a democracy. So the point of departure for my talk for thinking about critical thinking in non-Western cultures is how they can improve civic discourse in a particular area where we have critical thinking and needs for critical thinking in civic discourse. Okay, so that's one of the motivations. There's another motivation that comes from a different movement. The people who are in this movement are still basically getting it off the ground, and it is the intellectual virtues for education movement. Now, this movement is aligned with critical thinking education a lot, and the basic idea is that we don't want to just impart to students specific types of skills in critical thinking. What we want to give them is a model where we teach them how to have a disciplined mind of a certain kind. And those are the key concepts, a disciplined mind of a certain kind. So what do we mean by that? So you might think that there are certain traits that an undisciplined mind has. And we don't have to name any names, but you might be able to come up with some people you know from meetings that actually have these traits. So what? Intellectual conformity, intellectual hypocrisy, intellectual arrogance, intellectual unfairness, intellectual laziness, intellectual disregard for justice, intellectual distrust of reason, intellectual cowardice. Okay? So here are some. It's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a little way to grab onto the idea of what an undisciplined mind would be. Now you can contrast this with another model. Someone who has intellectual virtues. Intellectual autonomy, intellectual integrity, intellectual humility, confidence in reason, intellectual perseverance, fair-mindedness, intellectual courage, and intellectual empathy. So these traits are something that people who work in critical thinking education think is important, and that we need to move towards a model where these things are part of what we're putting into the educational package. And I firmly believe that this is the correct direction to go. So there's a question that I asked myself when I came across this sort of research. I started asking myself, do the books that we actually have available map the trend that is being advertised by Martha Nussbaum's Humanities for Democracy, as well as the intellectual virtues movement? So I'm looking at these two phenomenon, and I'm asking myself, does the stuff that we have available for the students map it? Right? So I already know plenty of teachers who actually don't like the standard books that are out there for the various reasons that I'm actually stating. And they actually go off reservation and actually choose very different ways to talk about critical thinking in their classrooms. But I can't pay attention to all the variation in classroom stuff. So what I'm doing is I'm doing a market analysis. I'm saying if these books are still sold, the ones I'm going to talk about in a minute, are sold everywhere all over the world and used, they're representing what's basically being taught. Okay? So the two books that I have focused my most attention on are one that's very old. I think it's now its 14th edition, and another one that's brand new in the UK. Now, these two books are used a lot to teach logic and critical thinking education. They're very popular, and they're constantly sold all the time. And what I want to do is I want to look at these two books in particular and start to make criticisms of them to show you why we need new books. That's what I'm going to do now. Okay? So the first challenge I'm going to bring forward is the one that you might have guessed from my title. And that's the fact that none of these books talk about at all any contributions from non-Western philosophers. So if you're studying critical thinking and you're getting titles like Critical Thinking with Socrates, you might think, oh, so this thing called critical thinking is just something that comes from, ancient Greece. But no one ever did that anywhere else. No one had any ideas about how to do that differently. And you might think, OK, that's the implicit message that's kind of being sent. And if it was historically true, then maybe we could go on this way. But it's historically false that there were no non-Western thinkers that had anything to offer. So why do we let these books continue to sell this message? I have no understanding of that whatsoever. So that's the first challenge that I think we should go for. The second challenge is that you can look at the first challenge, the cross-cultural challenge, and you can see that there's already pressure on the publishers to notice a change. So take this book, which is in its 8th edition. It started to make a change where it included references to famous women who had worked in logic and had contributed to logic. They made this shift from the prior 8 editions because there was finally pressure where people were saying, why are you constantly representing that logic is something only done by men and only men contributed to logic? And so they made this change. So now you have pages in this book where they talk about Ada Lovelace, who was one of the first computer programmers. More recently, someone like Ruth Markin-Barkas, who works in the field in which I got my PhD, which is modal logic. So you can see now that there's an interest in adding these elements into the book. And there's 2 reasons why, at least, that are good. One is it's historically true. 2, it actually helps give people a positive identity trajectory for learning logic. So it is a good thing to put in there. But if the argument holds here, then it seems to me like it holds here also. So if you're including the women because it gives a positive identity trajectory and it's also historically true, then if I can point to something from the Nyaya Sutra, and I can show you that's a relevant contribution to logic, why are we leaving it out? That's the question I'm asking. OK, next one. So there's another reason why I think the books have to change. And that's because there's a lot less focus these days on self-knowledge and critical thinking. This seems to be a place where there's some sort of gap that's happened. It used to be the case in classical philosophy, both in the East and West, that self-knowledge was one of the most important things that people talked about. Yet all these books have drifted away from that. It seems to me like it might be time to return to talking about self-knowledge in the context of critical thinking, and actually to put it at the center. Later on, if I have time, I'll try to show you how embedded within certain Indian logical systems, there's a distinction already at play between self-knowledge and knowledge for the other that's relevant here. But for the moment, I just want to note that the key idea is both whether you're talking about Socrates or the Buddha, self-knowledge seems to be really important. So why are we leaving that out of critical thinking education? OK, so from here, so there's another aspect. So many of these books teach a lot about fallacies. I'm sure, how many people have heard of what a fallacy is, an informal fallacy? Yes, OK, good. So you're familiar with this. Now, this stuff dates back to Aristotle, and it's very useful. I happen to not like the way a lot of teachers teach fallacies because they tend to put it in the voice of what's true or false about someone's argument, as opposed to what is a good question to ask someone to understand their argument. But the fallacies literature that is in our textbooks is not good enough, because we already have enough information from the sciences that we suffer from a lot of cognitive biases, that the human mind just is prone to implicit bias and cognitive biases. Why do these books fail to represent the fact that that's important information that we should be teaching in a critical thinking course? We should be putting that right alongside the fallacies to help people understand that if you're suffering from a cognitive bias when you're reasoning, it could be the case that when someone exposes that in reasoning to you, you both learn something together. So it seems very important that we update our textbooks by looking at the sciences of the mind. I take it very seriously that if you're not looking at the sciences of the mind and you're teaching critical thinking, there's going to be a gap in what you're doing. You have to look at the sciences of the mind to figure out something about what makes good critical thinking. All right. Going forward off this point, there's another challenge. That's the cognitive disability challenge. So it's well known now, and it's studied pretty well, and our university even has courses in this area, that many people suffer from autism or Asperger's, and that this is a spectrum disorder. So there's a natural question we might ask. How well do our books help us focus on the fact that people are on the spectrum and there's a phenomenon of neurodiversity? Are these books running afoul of the fact that those facts are relevant to how we do critical thinking? Are they sensitive to this information? And the answer is pretty much no. They don't talk about this stuff. So I think this is another area in which we need to look at how sciences can help us inform the critical thinking by now focusing at the debate on cognitive disability versus neurodiversity. Okay, so another area. Another area that's been of recent interest to me also is a population diversity challenge that I think these books face. So I taught a class on mass incarceration, and every sort of 2 years I teach a social justice class on an area of research. And so my last class was on mass incarceration. And so in that class, we actually flew out someone who works on prison to college pipeline programs, one that we have also. And we brought them out here to consult with us about how to build a good educational system that focuses on helping inmates. And one thing I discovered in that discussion was that we need to focus on critical thinking. And critical thinking seems to be a valuable tool. But if I was to teach critical thinking in these contexts, I wonder whether or not the books I would be using really help to serve the purpose for what I really want to help these people with. It's not that I think the books are bad. It's I think the books aren't geared at all towards the population. It's as if they were always marketed to the standard trajectory of going to college. But there seems to be a whole much larger population of people that might need critical thinking, and we need to look at that whole population in a much larger way. So one of the ways in which I think you can challenge the books is straightforwardly by looking at, are we really covering the diversity of population that's out there? Okay? So these challenges constitute my main 5 challenges to what's going on. So now I want to ask a question, how did we get here? How is it that we arrived at a place in critical thinking education where these challenges stand out so clearly as compared to what we have in the literature that's available? And in my research, I found that there was a report called the Delphi Report. And I'm curious, does anybody know the Delphi Report? Has anybody? Oh, you've heard of the Delphi. OK. So the Delphi Report was done in 1990, actually here in the Bay Area at Santa Clara University by Peter Facioni. And in this report, they basically defined what a critical thinker is and sold everybody on a model of critical thinking. And these are some main components of what they said. So for example, they said a good critical thinker, it has nothing to do with any given set of cultural beliefs, religious tenets, ethical values, social mores, political orientations, or orthodoxies of any kind. In addition, the commitment one makes as a good critical thinker is to always seek the truth with objectivity, integrity, and fair-mindedness. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't sound that bad, actually, as a definition. What's interesting to me about how they come up with this is that they took an expert consensus. So I tried to do research and find out who was in that expert consensus. And lo and behold, my research led me to the conclusion that they consulted with nobody that knew anything about any non-Western traditions and what they had to offer in logic and critical thinking. Otherwise, I just don't see how they could draw this conclusion. The expert consensus seems to me to have been biased from the beginning. They did not consult the right people. If they had consulted a wider group of people, I don't see how these 2 claims could have been made. So now I'm actually going to substantiate that by showing you the research that I actually did. So what we have is a model that they developed. This is the model they use. The core of critical thinking focuses down into analysis, inference, explanation, interpretation, self-regulation, and evaluation. So now I'm going to go through some of these components, and I'm going to show you that the definition they have is just false. There's no way it could be true. All right? So let's go. So now let's jump into it. So the first one is about inference and form. I'm going to start there. But I know some people might be of the really logically adept kind, so I just want to be careful about something. There are multiple notions in logic about what the function of logic is, what inference is, and what form is. If we want to have a technical discussion about that afterwards, I can do that. For the purposes of this, though, I can't really go that technical on that distinction. But I want to show you what's out there. So here's Aristotle on logic. This is the book that informs most critical thinking texts. And here are 2 principles that are at play in his text. The law of excluded middle tells us that every proposition is either true or false, and the law of non-contradiction tells us that no proposition is both true and false. These are 2 fundamental principles of Aristotelian logic. Now, suppose you're a scientist investigating the nature of light, and you're thinking on the basis of Aristotle's principles. You might formulate the following 2 things. Either light is particle-like, or light is not particle-like. It's not the case that light is both particle-like and not particle-like. Okay? So your frame of investigation, based on the Aristotelian principles, locks out a certain set of answers. But there are other ways you could think about the nature of reality. You could have studied some Buddhist logic. You could have studied some Tibetan logic. And then you would have been led to this, the 4 corners. Now your options are the following. Light is particle-like. Light is not particle-like. Light is both particle-like and not particle-like because of particle-wave duality. Light is neither particle-like nor not particle-like. So the option space that the Buddhist 4 corners are giving you opens you up to a new avenue of investigation that's closed out by the Aristotelian principles. So it's a controversial claim, what's going on in Buddhist logic. So if you are a logician and you want to go later have a technical conversation with me, I can defend it further. But for now, my main point of showing you something is cognitive frame. The cognitive frame coming out of Aristotle's principles is closing off certain answers. And certain answers seem to be true about the nature of the world that fit with the Buddhist model. So why can't I just have a page in a textbook that says, here's Aristotle's principles, here are the Buddhist principles. I'm not going to say who's right or who's wrong, but we have different models of how to investigate reality. That's all we need from this. We don't need to make a strong claim about who's right or who's wrong. We just need to show that there are multiple models. All right? So you can go further. Here's one from Jainism. So the Jain one is even more complicated than the Buddhist one because it's a 7-valued logic. It gives us 7 options for investigating reality, not just 4, not just 2. So rather than run through an example, because it's very complicated, I'm just going to point to one of the key ideas that they have at play. So in the Jain tradition, what's really important is that certain questions and certain ways of investigating things and certain answers just become unsayable. Whether it's true or false becomes something that is unsayable. So the option to say that certain things are unsayable is an open space in the Jain system. And that's just like saying in the Buddhist system that you have these 2 options also. Right? So the Jains and Buddhists disagree because they have one more set of options in their case versus the other case. OK, so here's some variation that I'm showing right away. So it must be the case that the claim that there is no cultural difference going on, I just don't see how that could be true. I just falsified it right here. The argument's done. At this stage, the model that the Delphi gives us has got to be wrong, because I just showed you cross-cultural variation. OK, so let's go further. Related to the idea of inference is also the idea of form. So the most common example used in a textbook to teach logical form is this example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. Aside from the sexism in this example, why are we teaching and talking about men to teach people and introduce them into logic? This is not the only way to set up an argument. There are other ways to set up an argument. So if you look in classical Indian philosophy, the model I'm actually using right now is this one. Okay? And let me run through this example real quickly. So the most commonly discussed example of good reasoning in the form of reasoning is this one. There's fire on the hill over there. The reason is there's smoke on the hill over there. The connection is where there's smoke, there's fire, such as in a kitchen and unlike on a lake. The smoke on the hill is like the smoke one observes in their kitchen and never on a lake. There's fire on the hill over there. So notice a difference right away. How many steps here? 2 steps and a conclusion. 3 elements. Here, 5. Okay? So in the history of what was going on, people would look at this and they would say this. One point alone appears certain, and that is that they, the Nyaya, can lay but slight claims to accuracy of exposition. This is proved clearly enough by the form of their syllogism, which is made to consist of 5 instead of 3 parts. 2 of these are manifestly superfluous, while by the introduction of an example in the third, the universality of the conclusion is vitiated. All right, so what is the complaint here? This is actually a very coherent complaint. This and the first step are redundant. Why is that there? This step seems superfluous. What does it do in the context of the argument? And this step seems completely bad because it confuses inductive and deductive reasoning. And that's a big problem. So if you're A.H. Ritter reading this stuff, you're looking at this, you're like, wait a minute, this is bad. And then it gets worse. I have a great doubt of Indian logical views becoming of any value whatever in the cause of general knowledge or science, or of ever having any fair claim to be admitted as an integral part of the Catholic philosophy of mankind. It is absurd to conceive that a logic can be of any value from a people who have not a single sound philosophical principle, nor any intellectual power whatever to work out a problem connected with human nature in a manner that is at all rational or intelligent. So this is sort of the pressure that's coming from colonialism at this time period. Now, look, if these criticisms are correct, I just want to make something clear, I wouldn't teach it. If these criticisms really make sense, I wouldn't teach them. But that's what I took my sabbatical to go and find out about. Is this right? Are these criticisms coherent criticisms of this, such that I should just give it up and not teach it and never think about it again? And I think the answer is just clearly no. So what's going on is that if you have this lens in mind, 3 steps, and a classic induction principle that tells you sampling 2 things is not good enough to inductively generalize to a universal conclusion, if you have those 2 things principles, the induction principle and Aristotle in mind, then if that's your lens and you're looking at this, of course it's gobbledygook. It's going to be bad. It's going to look like what you're looking at from there. You're like, okay, these steps give us deductive closure. These are premises. This follows from this. This is an induction principle. This step over here, where there is smoke, there is fire, such as in a kitchen and unlike on a lake. Well, those are two examples. That's not sufficient to draw a universal conclusion. This doesn't have the shape of an Aristotelian valid form, so this is just really bad. That's how the criticism came across. But I think it's just because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't realize that there are other things going on. So if you keep in mind that within classical Indian philosophy, there's a distinction between inference for oneself and inference for others. If you keep in mind that there are different intellects to which you would be reasoning with. If you keep in mind that there's something called binding and traction by the use of examples, not necessarily to prove a universal claim by citing examples, but to get someone to understand what you're talking about. And if you keep in mind the fact that a lot of Indian philosophy has to do with causal reasoning through presence and absence reasoning, this example won't seem so bad. So in the paper I published after my sabbatical, I go through this for like 30 pages trying to prove all the points. I won't prove all the points for you now, but we can talk about it if you want to see me prove the points for you. Right now, what I'll do is I'll give you a big high-level concept that unlocks the whole picture. And that's, what is the model that you're using to understand the model of reasoning? It's a second-order model. What is the model in your mind that you're using to read the first-order model by which you read all the instances of arguments? There are three models you can distinguish. The manipulation model. Reasoning is about getting you to believe what I want you to believe. Forget about whether it's the right way or the wrong way. The veridic model. Reasoning is about finding the truth. This model actually seems to be what was at play in the Delphi model. But there's another model called the erotetic model. In the erotetic model, reasoning is about engaging in questions during a certain pattern and answering those questions. So the truth might be a byproduct of us engaging in questions, but the ultimate goal is immediately for me to answer those questions as they're coming at me in a dialogical engagement. Right? So if you take the erotetic model, a lot of the criticisms that were given by the colonialists of this stuff just goes away, right away. Let's just see one. What are you trying to establish? There's a fire on the hill over there. Why do you believe that? There's smoke on the hill over there. Why does that establish anything? Wherever there's smoke, there's fire. Why believe that? Recall that in a kitchen when you are cooking, there's fire followed by smoke, but not on a lake. The situation is similar here. And so what follows from all this? There's a fire on the hill over there. So when you embed the erotetic questions, the idea that something is redundant and superfluous goes away, because it's relative to the questions being asked. When you see it without the questions, and you see it through the gaze of Aristotle and the induction principle, then you're confused. You're like, what is this really about? It's able to be unlocked only when you see that it's an erotetic model. So there is still an issue. People oftentimes ask me, well, Anand, I get how the erotetic model can really help you get out of the problem of redundancy and superfluousness, but I don't see how it solves the problem about induction. It looks like they're still confusing this thing about an inductive argument with a deductive argument. The way to see yourself out of that initially is to look at what they're trying to do. Why do I give an example in a conversation? It's because when I give an example, I anchor between me and my interlocutor, and I give them something to think about and tell me whether they've experienced the same thing. If they haven't experienced the same thing, then the probability that we're going to be able to go forward in a productive way shuts down really quickly. So Indian philosophers are very central to that. They're picking examples because they want to focus on dissecting the example through similarity relations so that they can get binding and traction with their interlocutor. If you know the example, then we can discuss it in detail, and then we can move back and forth from one another. So that's the idea. They're focusing on giving an example not to prove a universal claim by one instance, but to bring to someone's mind an idea that they can be familiar with. Okay? So, all right. So that has to do with inference and form. That's what all of that was about. So let's move on now away from inference and form back to the model. So the model gives these things, and what some people think is missing in the model, like I said earlier, is basically that there's no discussion of intellectual virtues. And so one of the things that we have to do automatically is just start adding in discussions of intellectual virtues right off the bat. So the debate is already at play in critical thinking education. One camp wants to say that critical thinking education does not involve transmitting to students something like a critical spirit where the intellectual virtues are at play. And another camp says, no, what you're doing is you're transmitting that also. So we've got the skills and we've got the virtues, right? So I'm in the second camp. Actually, in the paper I wrote, I'm actually in a third camp, which says it's skills plus virtue plus a correct historical understanding of the virtues in relationship to the skill. Because this debate doesn't give us the historical understanding of why the virtues matter in relationship to the skill. So the one I favor is a comprehensive model of history in relationship to character, in relationship to skill. Okay. The question that I think at the top of my mind when I saw this stuff was, why are we looking at intellectual virtues as if they only come out of Aristotle? He had a lot of great things to say about intellectual virtues, and almost all of them that he says I really love. But he's not the only one on the block who had something to say. There are other people, in fact, and oh, oops, did we just lose it? Oh no, here we go. So, in a very old Ayurveda text called the Karaka, there's a long discussion about the nature of how interlocutors should talk to one another. And this passage pertains directly to the distinction between the character view and the skill view. So let me just read the important part. The friendly discussion is held with one who is endowed with learning, understanding, and the power of expression and contradiction, devoid of irritability, having uncensored knowledge, without jealousy, able to be convinced and convince others, enduring and adept in the art of sweet conversation. While in discussion with such a person, one should speak confidently, put questions unhesitatingly, reply to the sincere questioner with elaborateness, not be agitated with fear of defect, not be exhilarated on defeating the partner, nor boast before others, nor hold fast to his solitary view due to attachment, not explain what is unknown to him, and convince the other party with politeness, and be cautious in this method of friendly discussion. This passage seems to cover some of the intellectual virtues that I listed earlier. In fact, and also there may be divergence. So one of the questions I'm concerned with is this. We build a certain model of intellectual virtues and then we teach it, but we didn't check cross-culturally whether everyone has those same intellectual virtues, so we just land in a mess. So the better way, I think, to do it is to look and say, okay, we want intellectual virtues to be part of our education package in critical thinking, but we ought to look elsewhere to see what variation there is. That's what I think is the interesting question coming out of this. And this passage substantiates actually convergence more than divergence. Okay? Okay, and now my favorite thing. So if there's one thing that you leave here today with that's a tool from classical Indian philosophy that's useful to think about in a lot of situations, it's this. Absolutely, you can trash the rest of it, but this one, the next time you're in a meeting with a whole bunch of people and everyone's getting heated, I want you to think about this, to put this in the forefront of your consciousness. It will de-escalate things, okay? So this is the parable of the elephant. Arguably, it originates in Jainism. I'm not 100% sure. It's also found in Buddhist texts also. But it's pretty clear that it's floating around in both those periods around the Shramana movement in classical Indian philosophy. So in the way the story is actually told, a king brings before 6 blind men or 5 blind men an elephant. And he asks him to tell them what it is. Now each of them, touching a different part of the elephant, says what they think it is. So one touching the ear says it's a fan, another touching its side says it's a wall, touching its tail says it's a rope, another one touching the feet says it's a tree, another one touching the snout says it's a snake, another one touching the tusk says it's a spear. Okay? And then they start debating with one another. And it's, of course, disagreement, which is a classic situation we find ourselves in. And so the point that the Jains draw from this in the actual story is that the king who can see everything is the one who knows. But the other people who are blind and limited in their knowledge in a certain region, they can't know. They're kind of stuck. Okay? So this situation, the elephant situation, we're in a lot of times. We're debating people, and we think we're right in virtue of the connection we have to the evidence before us, but we don't have the complete set of evidence. And we just keep pushing on the point that we have evidence for. But in those situations, if you refocus your attention to this, you can de-escalate things. Because by pushing on what I call the elephant button, you get yourself to think about the fact that maybe you don't have all the evidence. And maybe the reason why you're at cross purposes with other people is because you're only seeing part of the picture. So one of the core ideas that comes out of Jainism is the idea that knowledge is situated and it's limited, because we are finite knowers. It's a very cool idea, and it's done very well in this passage. Now, what's interesting also about this is that you can use this example in a critical thinking class to teach students about critical thinking, to make the point about limited knowledge, but you don't even have to pay so much respect to the Jain tradition as if you can't criticize it itself. Because look, you can look at the way this is set up and you can ask yourself the following questions. Wait a minute. It looks like it's only a bunch of men taking care of the elephant. Maybe we need some women in the conversation also. And also, by the way, how did the elephant get there? Did the elephant consent to be investigated? So you can actually use this one thing in class, and I guarantee you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. I was thinking about Kennedy's response to Trump in the State of the Union address. And I noticed that one of the main moves he used logically was this sort of oppositional thing, where he's saying, you're being told that you can either choose this or that, this or that. So in Western logic, that's called false dichotomy. He was basically pointing out, hey, you're being pitched a bunch of false dichotomies. But I don't know, I can just do it this way too. I can say he's just doing the elephant argument. He's like, wait a minute, someone's telling you that all the evidence points to either it's just the fan or it's just the rope. But in reality, there's more evidence that says you can get both, right? So in the elephant situation, you can actually analyze political dialogue in terms of the closure of whether or not things are being presented in a binary way when the evidence is not binary. Okay? So this example can give you a lot of mileage in a lot of situations. All right, so if there's anything you remember, please remember this. I think it's really important. Okay? So one of the other things I was working on is trying to relate this stuff in Jainism to feminist standpoint epistemology, because it's really important in philosophy of science, and it's done a lot of positive work. And the chair of our department, Janet Stemwedel, sitting right there, is someone who has done a lot of work herself on it and knows a lot about it. So I became interested in trying to see, are there connections between what's going on in this Jain example, which actually, there's a structural name in Jain philosophy for this sort of thing. It's called Nyayavada, which means perspective. It actually means a perspectival reasoning. And I realized that there could be a connection. There could be a similarity that both groups are triangulating towards the same phenomenon out there in the world, just doing it from different things. So typically, standpoint epistemology recognizes two types of theses. One thesis is the situated knower thesis, that each of us are finite knowers from a social, historical, contextual background with limited capacities. Okay, but they have this other component that's very important. Okay, and it's the systemic situated knowledge thesis. Let me read this real quick. So what distinguishes standpoint theory from other genres of social epistemology predicated on a generic situated knowledge thesis is its focus on the epistemic effects of systemic structures of social differentiation. Standpoint theorists are concerned to understand the impact on what we know and how we know of our location in hierarchical systems, of power relations that structure our material conditions of life, and the social relations of production and reproduction that in turn shape our identities and our epistemic capacities. So there's two elements, the situated knower thesis and the differential thesis. Okay? Now, when you look at this example, I think very quickly you can get this. You should be able to see the generic situated knower thesis. There is that commonality. So the question is, if the Jain tradition actually has something that comes close to feminist standpoint epistemology, it better be because they can also get this thesis. So in the research I just completed a week ago for a paper I'm publishing, I have now shown that you can actually get this result too, that you don't just get the primary result. So you actually can get from this example, for our other Husserl scholar in the room, you can actually get the perceptual anticipations in Husserl, where you walk around the ball and you can anticipate what's coming around. The situated knower thesis here gives you perceptual anticipations in Husserl, and I think it can get you both components of standpoint epistemology. So I won't go into the details unless people want to talk about that, but that's an added aspect I think you will see, that this tradition is giving us something that's actually similar to something that's going on right now that a lot of people think is important. Okay, so I'll pass that. So let's go to the last part. So one thing that's really clear is let's just put everything aside and now just focus on what they have. Let's say we agreed now with what they gave us in the Delphi report. And we took everything here and we took nothing cross-cultural. There's a big gap in our critical thinking education. Pretty much no book and pretty much no class until maybe the last 3 years, it started about 3 years ago, no class focuses on regulation. Show me where in the Hurley book there's any discussion of regulation, how one self-regulates. There's no discussion. None of the books that are out there focus on self-regulation. Yet, if we just bought the model they gave us without me criticizing it, you would think that you were missing one of the main components. It's sitting right there. OK, so Buddhism has a lot to say about that, because meditation goes very well with emotion regulation, and we know that that works well. So already many universities are taking on board the idea that mindfulness meditation can be a very good component of mental health for students on campus. There's lots of ways in which this is done. Oftentimes it's done in stress management. Oftentimes it's done in part of kinesiology. Oftentimes it's done part of clubs on campus. In fact, I'm the director of the yoga club and the art of living club. So I know there are a lot of people on campus that do this anyway. So I think it's a very good component, but it's missing in critical thinking, is my point, is that it actually needs to be there. And there's a relevant reason why. A lot of the research is focusing now on meditation and stress management, but my own research direction has shown me that this is not the most profitable place to actually look. The profitable place to look is stereotype threat. This is an actual problem. So how many people are familiar with this term? Stereotype threat? Some people? OK, good. OK, so let me explain it. So stereotype threat is when you're in a situation in which a well-known stereotype is likely to be known by the people around you. OK? And because you're afraid of confirming that stereotype that's oftentimes negative, you fail to perform as well. Okay? It's a really well-studied problem. And it's a really big problem in critical thinking. Because if you're reasoning with someone who you think has these thoughts about you, and that you're going to confirm those thoughts for them, and then they're going to back off from you, your performance and reasoning is going to go down. That's what the stereotype threat predicts. So helping someone function when they're in a live stereotype threat situation is very important for exercises of critical thinking. Not for sitting in the classroom where you're safe, but for a dangerous situation where it's live. That's the difference. So meditation works on that. In fact, one of the most important studies that was recently done already showed that with respect to women in math performance, meditation of 5 minutes only reduces stereotype threat effect. That's pretty powerful. So I'm thinking what we need to do is focus on self-regulation with respect to stereotype threat, and we need to study exactly how it affects it, whether or not meditation can help in the critical thinking context. All right, so this last part of what I'm talking about, this alone is just a missing component of the model I already gave you. So how do we change the situation? My idea is to make new textbooks. I'm working on some NEH summer seminars. And the last thing I want to talk about is smartphone apps, because I think technology can help here. So I want to talk about that briefly. So my wife, sitting over there, runs a startup in San Francisco. And this startup is called Nightlight Meditation. And it's a meditation app that you can get on your phone or you can go online and use. And basically what this app allows you to do is it allows you to do social meditation. That is, it allows you to meditate with people from the convenience of your home, your car, or wherever, in a group, online, and have an experience of meditation that is productive for you. It fosters community. It allows you to work with people you know. It allows you to meet with your family. And we ran a trial run in one of my classes last term where we had the students use Nightlight before they took their exam. And we took some anecdotal evidence from them, some reports and surveys, and it all was positive. But this seems like a way to solve a problem. Suppose you're teaching critical thinking, but you have no idea how to teach meditation. You can just assign this. And by assigning this, your students can try and integrate the two elements that are missing. All right. So I need your help because I think I'm in the elephant situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I use Headspace, by the way, for meditation. I love it, but it's not a social meditation app, but it works. Well, and I haven't taken philosophy of science for about 20 years, so forgive me if I make a lot of mistakes here. But I thought about the discussions you had, the either-or dichotomy and the concerns with that, and kind of the cross-cultural perspectives of logic and critical thinking. But when I took philosophy of science, I remember starting with the either-or dichotomy and the issues with falsificationism and kind of moving through Popper and Feyerabend and getting to hermeneuticism, talking about that the praxis and kinesis and the way in which you think about coming up with answers to some of these issues. How is that different than what you're describing? It seems like there has been a philosophy of thought that kind of discusses and describes the way in which we think and the way in which we differentiate.
So there isn't a difference from that description. Unless I'm shown some specific thing that I can look into and inquire into, I can't really see the difference.
Do we not teach that? I mean, we do not teach that kind of fundamental philosophy science perspective on, falsificationism and the issue?
Yeah, of course we do. We teach philosophy of science and we cover all of that stuff. So is the worry that we're already doing something that takes care of all of this? Yeah, I don't see that. I think it's the opposite. I think there's a lot of worry to think that philosophy of science doesn't cover all this. And there's also another important reason to talk about it in this way. I mean, is it historically informed at all? I mean, are we actually selling implicitly a message that if you just learn the philosophy of science model, then you've got the complete picture and there's no variation? A, I don't think that we have the empirical evidence to support that. B, I don't think all the evidence is going to show that what's coming out of 20th century philosophy of science can't be better informed by something from Buddhist logic. So it looks like there's at least room to maneuver. Now, some of the things that you've mentioned also, I think, could be somewhat problematic. Like, it's not like there's a theory of falsification within classical Indian philosophy that I think you're going to just pop out right away. But there are very interesting theories of causation and causal inference. And if you think causal inference is a very important part of scientific reasoning, well, then I don't see any reason why not to actually look there. In fact, there has been research recently done that shows the following result, that we attribute to John Stuart Mill the introduction of Mill's methods. Has anyone heard of those? These are very common methods for causal reasoning. It's recently been argued that actually the Nyaya system of absence and presence causal reasoning is the historical source for Mill's idea. So there's a lot of people doing research on this thing where they're backtracking and showing how some of the ideas that flowed in from British empiricism into the 20th century have roots actually in classical Indian philosophy because of the British East India Company. So there's a whole research program where I don't really work on that kind of stuff. I'm more interested in the ideas and whether they're solving problems in the critical thinking classroom. But that's another way of thinking, are we getting the historical representation right? I can't see all the people in the back. Okay, you go in the back first.
Obviously, just using one cultural corner of the world to deal with a human issue is kind of a little silly. You need all the great minds around the world. But I'm curious, and critical thinking was kind of a downfall in my own personal family. But is your philosophy class, I mean, basically philosophy, first question, last question, what does it mean to live well? And you need critical thinking. The better critical thinking, the better you're going to answer that question. I'm wondering, see, I once made a statement a lot of years ago that of all the books and all the shelves and all the courses of philosophy in the world, I'm wondering what's the course that say, what does it mean to live well? Like keep it simple type thing.
So
is that, to me, that's the bottom line, philosophy. What does it mean to live well?
okay, so I'm not addressing that specific issue, although I think it's a very important part of philosophy to answer and give answers to the question of what it means to live well. What I'm basically trying to say that is related somewhat to your question is basically there is something called critical thinking courses that are taught all over America and Canada and UK. And I think I've just established the fact that the most common books used completely don't take into consideration. Yeah, that's right. You had a question?
Yeah, I have a comment and question. First is I really appreciate, as a chemist, your example there of light and how that basically disproves this either or.
Yeah.
Another one with respect to that is your in your Jane 7-value model of the unsayable is Heisenberg's statement that you cannot know both the position and momentum of anything both precisely, and so that's an unsayable thing, and that's also accepted in science. So making concrete these examples that Western thinkers might at first sort of reject instinctively, I think is very valuable for
yeah, I mean, I sometimes I typically allow the conversation to go the other way to invite stronger. There's actually a lot more. It takes a lot of work to get Buddhist logic and Jain logic off the ground, actually. So I'm actually being honest with you. I'm hiding a little bit of the technical difficulties, but I know I can answer them. I've already dealt with the hardest logicians on the block about this, and I know I have my answers ready for it. But the reason why I chose that example is precisely because I think it intuitively can help people who have a science education understand how what they're saying could have helped shape the cognitive frame and trajectory of inquiry. That's the key idea. Yeah. So
the question that I have is related to the slide here and the other ways to potentially fix critical thinking education. Have you looked at the sort of within the CSU system, our definition of area A3, critical thinking? Have you looked at the AAC&U's value rubric for critical thinking? Have you looked at standardized tests that purport to measure critical thinking?
Yes,
and
I have.
whether or not those reflect a Western bias as well?
they do. So actually, I was the G representative for San Jose State on A3 all the way until they changed the A3 rules. I taught a class on the meta theory of critical thinking in the philosophy department where we looked at how do you think I found the Delphi report and all these rubrics and stuff like that. So I've been looking at it pretty carefully. I mean, honestly, I think the A3 change we made is the wrong direction. My own personal view is that it was the wrong direction. I think dropping out certain components of mathematical logic from critical thinking education is an absolute disaster, especially nowadays where it seems like that kind of material and knowledge is very important. So we went left and I was there for the debates, but the thing is, I don't understand it really. And I studied it before we had the vote. I actually taught a class, went through what we were doing, why we were doing it with my students. And surprisingly, I'll tell you one thing that you probably don't know unless you teach a lot of critical thinking. We think that the measurable skills, like can they detect a fallacy, is important. Can they identify an argument pattern form is important. You know, honestly, after 20 years of teaching it, I can't say that those are the things I walk away thinking my students are most happy about. The number one thing, in my experience of 20 years of teaching this class, that I would say is important about critical thinking education is confidence. That's the thing we don't even measure to bother to think about. But most of my students come back to me saying, what I've learned is how to be confident in expressing my own voice, because I have a system for understanding information in which I can feel comfortable that I haven't made a fundamental error in my reasoning. And that amplifies confidence in a situation where you don't know the subject matter, you don't know the people, you might be seen under a stereotype threat. So I think it's actually confidence in reason that's the key thing that's important. And actually, all the metrics that I've seen, they don't measure that at all. They measure all these other things. Yeah. I don't know who's first. Marcia?
Sure. So I'm concerned why you left white supremacy out of this discussion, because it seems fairly obvious given the two quotes from Ritter and Blake.
Yeah.
But that's what's at play. And if you're talking about critical thinking education, why not consider that aspect of education
Okay, so that's a very good question, and I have one part of it I can answer, the other part I'll just claim ignorance. So the first part of it is because Ritter's criticism is logically sound. If it is true that the five-step syllogism has a property of redundance, superfluousness, and inductive, deductive, then it seems like that could be a reason not to have it in the book. But it's only after you unlock the argument pattern and show how it can be used in an aerotetic model that you're out of that. So then my guess on the second part is, yeah, there doesn't seem to be any reason why discussing issues like that is something you can't do in a critical thinking class. It's just that I don't need to draw that card here to defend this. What I need to show is that the aerotetic model unlocks how the system works, and that's what they were missing. Chris?
Yeah, there's something that comes out of the mind sciences that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is that students have different learning styles.
Yes, that's right.
And so they might not all be really good at grasping, for example, mathematical logic, but there may be, you may be able to figure out a way to get them.
So we already did a study.
Grasp
Professor Rick Thiessen was a member of our department who died recently. But while he was here, him and I actually ran a study on students learning formal logic, and we found that there's a pattern differentiation between using lowercase letters and shapes. And now, from that moment on, I constantly teach logic by focusing on teaching the principles in terms of shapes versus letters. Some students can do substitution instances quicker with shapes, like circles, squares, and triangles, and other ones can do it better with x, y, z's, lowercase p, lowercase q. So there does seem to be a variation in substitution that I have found. So I think that that is important. That's one of the areas in which I'm trying to get students to improve on it. And the test I ran showed that this way of teaching it both ways helps them learn it quicker.
I think we have time for one last
Yeah.
question.
No.
Thank you, Anand. Just a comment on diversity.
Yeah.
So in mainstream sort of philosophical thinking, there's a lot of talk about diversity and so forth. And I guess that, APA would probably embrace this because it's sort of diversity in a sort of more abstract sense. But one of the, and of course the feminist element there as well is another gesture towards. But the other element of diversity on the sort of ground is really the diversity of the population that we now have, and the different ways in which people are thinking about things from their cultural perspectives and so forth. And there's the tendency to sort of rule that out completely, seems odious, particularly in sort of applied ethical situations as well. When you have in a doctor's surgery or in what's called mental health consultations and so forth as well, people come up and they're coming from cultural perspectives, and of course, if the response does not take account of that, then it becomes just another part of the mainstream situational thinking. Right? I wonder if you have something to say on that. I mean,
Is the worry that it'll somehow become superficially an attempt to get diversity? Is that the idea?
Yeah, well, or rather more in the abstract. So you can take things from the Buddhist tradition, Nyaya tradition, and so forth, which
Yeah.
you work on, which is all very well. But in terms of, sort of the applied context, is it going to have any application?
But I mean, he just gave a perfect example. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle would be arrived at quicker through the unsayability. And some translations of Octavia are indeterminacy. I mean, you've given one yourself like that. So yeah, I mean, so I think there are ways to see it. I mean, I don't have all the examples, but the thing is, cognitive framing seems to be one issue. Application seems to be another. Even if the cognitive frame over-generates possibilities, as in the search space, it's fine. The overgeneration of the possibilities doesn't mean it's a hindrance to the mind figuring out a solution. If you still end up with a P or not P situation in your reasoning, you're going to get that from the Buddhist one and the Jain one also, but you're going to generate other possibilities that you might not get from Aristotle. So I don't think it's a superficial claim. I'm choosing these particular things because I think they actually do something in the context of real critical thinking. And I think when I look to other traditions like the Arabic tradition, I'm looking for particular tools that actually do some work. And then of course, it's an open debate whether everyone wants to ratify this and say this is the way to go forward. That's a second situation. But the first stage, I think, you got to collect up some different ideas and then see where you can go.
Well, Dr. Vaidya, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.